science is one of the most dependable barometers that we have about the nature of the human being in times of extreme crisis and in times of millennial change. He was born in 65 BC and died in 8 BC, which places him right at the center of the change in the world. When Horace was born, if you recall, or if you've been attending the previous lectures, the changes in the world had mounted to a condition of complete and utter chaos. By the time that Horace was 2 years old, the Catalan conspiracy openly portrayed the extent of plots in the city of Rome on the scale of perhaps sending in several hundred armed men and murdering as many senators of the Roman Empire Republic as possible. And it was only thwarted by the midnight torchlight courage of Cicero, who literally roused Roman citizens out of their beds. This was in 63 BC, and during that year was the birth of Octavian, Caesar. Virgil had been born some 5 years before Horace, and the great literary figure and Secretary of State of Augustus, Maecenas, had been born just 2 years before. So I think I should put these in some sort of order for you so that you can see in a diagram. This will use yellow. The central figure was Augustus, and his wife of many, many years, Livia, and his great supporter, Maecenas. Maecenas was the urbane Etruscan man who gathered around himself a literary coterie. He was a very wealthy man, but he also was the trusted, what we would call Secretary of State. Whenever there was a negotiation that Augustus had to be sure that it was done right, Maecenas was in charge. For instance, several times before Mark Antony's armies were defeated, Augustus and Mark Antony were engaged in very, very tricky negotiations. And on all occasions, Maecenas was the man in charge of the negotiations. Now, Augustus had a relationship one-to-one with Virgil. And Virgil, if you were here last week, was the great epic poet of the Roman civilization. Horace, who we are dealing with tonight, had the same relationship with Maecenas as Virgil did with Augustus. And Horace and Virgil were related together as the two greatest literary geniuses of the day. On the other side of Augustus was his great general friend, Agrippa. So that Augustus, as the centerpiece of a mandala of competent power, was flanked by four functions of human life that are absolutely necessary to the construction of a civilization and the survival of the human spirit. On one side was his long-term wife, Livia, to whom he was utterly faithful. This was the family development. And you have to remember that when the Principate was established, technically around 19 BC, it had to reestablish all the family values that had been shredded by 130 years of civil war. So Livia represented that aspect of what Augustus stood for, as the term that he used was princeps. Princeps later became prince. the princeps for Augustus meant first. It meant that in the Roman Senate, he was the first among many. But later on in history, it becomes prince. And so the whole notion of the nobility of the prince comes from this word, this Latin word. On the military side, in order to ensure that the armies, the legions, who had grown to enormous proportions, there were upwards of 50 or 60 legions on the fields of battle at the time that the civil wars were brought to a close. And it was a real problem. Each legion had 7,000 or 8,000 fighting members. So you can imagine that a city that had control of almost 500,000 men in arms in that day, scattered all over the face of the known world, had a problem digesting peace. It was a major problem because the tradition by that time was that victorious armies were given land and were settled. And if you had every 5 or so years 500,000 soldiers to be resettled, you would run out of land to give them. And you would be dispossessing people who, in their own living tradition, had already been given land. So Augustus had a monumental problem of keeping the power to maintain the empire and to reduce the armies by about a factor of 3 so that they could deal with them. Agrippa, and we don't have time in the series to go into his life, very great man, formative man, handled the military aspect, so the family and the military. On the cultural aspect, Augustus wanted to have around him persons whose spirit was whole. And so he relied on individuals that in his sight had managed to grow up and keep their wholeness and still have the kind of competence of individuals that could think on their feet in the terms of the old rhetorical education, but still have contact with the kinds of spiritual values that were held in great esteem in the old republic. A simpleness of life, a quality of believing in a divine purpose for human nature, the willingness to forego personal triumphs and a spirit of self-sacrifice in order to ensure a collective stability. So Maecenas represented this on the cultural vein. All of the literary figures, all of Roman literature that comes to us, and this is called the Silver Age, in contrast to the Golden Age of Periclean. It's not much less of a great age. All of the literary figures of that age were friends of Maecenas. He was the one that brought them together. He's the one that had the wealth. For instance, in the question of Horace, we'll see that Maecenas gives Horace a villa north out of Rome in a place called Tivoli today. Tivoli. It was called Tiber in ancient times. And there's a mountain here, it's about 30 miles out of Rome to the north. Maecenas gave him a farm, a place of retreat. He also is the one who introduced Virgil to Augustus. So Maecenas and Agrippa and Livy handled these aspects. This was the outer form of this mandala of empire and power. And Augustus was very serious about reinstating the human nature of the world in its proper order. He believed that he had done it, and all of these people at that time believed that he had done it also. The mystical side was handled by Virgil. And the Aeneid is not just a work of literature. It's not just a novel. It's not just something that you read for pleasure. It is the scripture upon which the vision of their entire purpose and origins was founded. And it contains within it, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a transformative, epical way, the process by which human understanding of envisionment comes into physical, historical unfoldment. And Virgil wrote the textbook as well as Homer had done it for his generation. So that this mandala of power, with Augustus at the center, covered all of the aspects of manifestation. And tonight, when we look at Horace, we look at someone who is on this corner of this mandala of power. He is a great friend of Virgil. He is a great friend of Maecenas. And he was asked by Augustus, when he was about 35 years of age, to be his personal secretary. And Horace, characteristically enough, said, it is a wonderful treat to be offered a position of power, but I really like walking in anonymity on the streets of Rome. And I would rather be in a position where all the footsteps I hear are not coming toward me, but some of them are moving away and some with me. I don't want to be in a position that all the footsteps I hear are coming toward me. So he turned it down. What is extraordinary about all this is the symmetry of circumstance that emerges in actual history. If you recall, Virgil was born in the far north of Italy on a farm up near Mantua. Horace was born in the far south of Italy on a farm. They came from polar opposites of the Italian landscape. Horace's birthplace is called Venusia. It's down near the heel of Italy. And what's even more striking is that Horace's father had been a slave and was technically what was known as a freedman. So in having, in one lifetime, the son of a slave be offered the private secretaryship of the emperor of the world is an unbelievable jump. And it also shows the incredible old Republican democratic vision that Augustus himself embodied. That what they were after were capable human beings and not positions of hierarchical power, inherited or otherwise. Horace, in fact, was the product of the devotion of his ex-slave father. His father, when he was freed, got a position, a job, known as a co-auctor. In less informed times, they used to think this meant a tax collector. But what a co-auctor was in Roman times was the companion of an auctioneer. And the auctioneers in the Roman Empire were responsible for the sale of an enormous quantity of goods. You can picture a large food bazaar and then put in that bazaar all the goods and services that you can imagine. Real estate, household goods, services, and everything. All of this kind of wealth was brought to the auction block so that the co-auctor, who was the companion of the auctioneer, in the sense that he handled all the financing. And one had to pay in cash at the auctions. And so the co-auctor very often was the banker who lent the money on the spur of the moment to people who bought and then ensured that he was repaid. So the co-auctor also was a financier and a banker, as well as someone who just worked with the auctioneer. So that Horace's father, from the position of being a slave, in a very short while, 10 or 15 years or so, working as a co-auctor, had set enough money aside so that he devoted himself exclusively to the education of his little son, Horace. We hear nothing of Horace's mother. We don't know who she was. She is never mentioned. She figures not at all in the story of his life. But his father, on the testimony of Horace, it's one of the few times in the ancient classical world that we find someone writing well of their father, of their parent. And Horace eulogizes his father, saying that he was the epitome of the self-sacrificing old republic type of Roman. Even though an ex-slave, definitely the kind of quality of individual that made it possible for him to flourish. And what the father did was that he took him out of the schooling system that was current on the south of Italy. Horace uses the phrase, "I no longer had to carry my slates with the sons of centurions." His father took him to the city of Rome and spent his life savings getting him the best education money could buy. And he got a fantastic education. And then, to ensure that Horace was as polished as could be, he paid for him to go to Athens and study at Plato's Academy. And one of the classmates of Horace there was the son of Cicero. And of course, when he arrived in Athens, it was like the penultimate education. It's like going to Oxford University in England today. So that Horace, through the dedication of his father, became an extraordinarily educated individual. Horace physically was a very short man and very portly. And he had one of these kinds of personalities that everyone loved. He was able to poke fun at himself in kind of an urbane way, and we'll see some examples of this. And this lovability and intelligence, interspersed with this humility of character, made Horace one of the most likable individuals of all time. In fact, after all this unraveled and the world entered what we call today still the Dark Ages, in the old cheerless centuries of the medieval world, people, monks and so forth, would read Horace for genuine human contact and pleasure, and they could scarcely believe that human nature had ever been this lovable and dear, this close to the sources of power. It always was a mystery to them, and they figured that Horace must have made many things up, that his letters to Augustus and Maecenas and Virgil must have just probably been made up, that they were fictitious literary works. Of course, they were entirely legitimate. While he was at the academy, and you have to envision now that Plato's Academy was known in antiquity as the groves of the academy. There were not really rooms like this, but there were garden complexes, which were imitated in Alexandria also, where there were long walkways. And these groves of trees afforded bucolic settings wherein conversations of the deepest nature could take place, not in a planned way, but in an offhand sort of a way, so that one was not given a program to follow in a categorical, hierarchical way, but rather one was introduced to an environment, a milieu, as the French would say, in which intuition and intelligence and capacity were always given nutrition and encouraged to come into play, so that if you found yourself in a conversation that was really getting somewhere, that you were beginning to have an insight, you could, within a few minutes, stroll with your companion or companions or yourself to some setting, garden setting, which would then support the natural unfoldment of this intelligence and this conversation. There were times in the world when intelligence had its way. We got here because there were, fortunately, great individuals. Thomas Jefferson used to use his garden the same way. This education of Horace produced in him a very, very, very beautiful quality of manhood. But the circumstances of the times were peculiar. While he was there, when he was 21 years old, finishing up at Plato's Academy, Julius Caesar was murdered in the Forum, in Rome. And this whole story that we've been telling the last 2 or 3 weeks the unfoldment of the vengeance of Augustus, the second triumvirate, and so forth. All of this was happening. But in terms of Horace, he was in Athens when Brutus, one of the major assassins of Julius Caesar, came to Greece to raise legions to wrest the empire from the tyrannical Caesars. And the young, excellent Horace met Marcus Brutus and was very impressive to him, so that Brutus created a military position for Horace called the tribunate. There were usually 6 tribunes in every legion. The patrician class were the consuls that were the generals for the legions. But the plebeian class, the ordinary common person, had as their highest office the tribunes, who also could command, but they were like lieutenants or majors instead of like generals or colonels. There were usually 6 tribunes to a legion. Horace was put in charge of one of the legions at the final battle between the forces of Augustus and Brutus at the Battle of Philippi. And so Horace remarks in one of his writings that he, least likely of all men alive, found himself on the field of battle in charge of an entire legion in this epical battle of the old republic against the tyrannical new Caesars. And of course, originally he was on the side of the Republicans, on the side of Brutus. And if you recall, Philippi was a total rout of the forces of Brutus and the old Republicans. The envisioned, vengeant armies of Augustus, professional military men, simply cut through the sort of do-gooder, hastily raised legions of Brutus. And Horace records in one of his famous odes his action upon the field of battle that day, when one of his old friends dies. He writes in the second book of odes, the 7th ode, his friend, a certain Pompeius, he's writing to him this ode. He says, he wrote, "A Roman citizen, and given you back your native gods and weather, we two once beat a swift retreat together under Philippi's field, when I dumped my poor shield, and courage cracked, and the strong men who frowned fiercest fell, chins to the miry ground. But I, half dead with fear, was wafted airborne clear of the enemy lines, wrapped in a misty blur by Mercury, not sucked back as you were from safety and the shore by the wild tide of war." And of course, this reference to a misty cloud and Mercury coming is taken from Homer, from the Iliad, of certain heroes that are singled out by fate and circumstance, by the gods, are saved. And it's also sort of a saving grace that you really weren't afraid because the gods came and took you out of the battle. But Horace says, in fact, I had flipped my shield and my courage had cracked and I ran. It was peculiar that the very forces that he would be running from in just a few years would find him as one of the leading spokesmen in that cause, and that the great supreme commander of all those forces would be asking him to be his personal secretary. An absolutely astounding turn of events. After Philippi, Horace returned to Rome, and he found himself in the very same circumstance that Virgil found himself in. Both of them had had their ancestral properties taken from them, and they were totally dispossessed. They were broke. They had nothing to go on. Both of them found that their lands had been given to soldiers under Augustus, and both of them had, oddly enough, gone to the same man through odd meeting quirk circumstance, Maecenas. And Maecenas, in both cases, had rectified the situation. In Virgil's situation, he got the family farm returned to Virgil's father, but Virgil never went back home, if you remember. He went on down to Naples, outside of Naples, camped himself actually on the ridges above the Cumaean Sibyl's cave, there to write this great final envisioning epic of Rome, the Aeneid. Horace also did not return home, but rather stayed in Rome and became a sort of a permanent house guest of Maecenas. Maecenas had an enormous palace on the Esquiline Hill in Rome. And it was one of the most palatial villas in Rome at the time. Maecenas was probably the J. Paul Getty of his day, one of the most wealthy men. And Horace suddenly found himself in this man's presence. And because of Maecenas' tremendous literary pull, he found himself publishing in about 35 BC one of his first collections of poems. They're called the epoets now. It's really a misnomer. It's taken from an old Greek literary form. He actually called them iambi, which just meant verses, really. Verses in an iambic meter. In the first ode, though, he addresses himself to this same Maecenas, and he writes, "Maecenas, son of royal stock, my friend, my honor, my firm rock, the enthusiastic charioteer stirs up the Olympic dust, then, clearing turning post with red-hot wheels, snatches the victor's palm and feels Lord of the earth, God among men. The patrician glories when the fickle voters designate him 3 times public magistrate." And so he goes on with the first ode to Maecenas, saying what a wonderful thing it is to have certainty, finally, and someone with real clout in the culture to speak for himself. Not just a prosaic, sort of a sheltering, but in fact a further, because Horace is one of the world's really great poets. And Maecenas, whose job it was, under this mandala of Augustan refurbishing of the world vision, Maecenas was in charge of making sure that the cultural expressions of this world emerging civilization were accurate spiritually, were historically viable, and would be promulgated to the world at large. So that Horace, in being associated with Maecenas, was assured that his poems would be read from Spain to India, from Africa to the Scythian wastes of the Arctic. So he began to take stock of his capacities as a poet, and he realized that he was not the great shipbuilding kind of epic poet that Virgil was. Virgil, if you remember, worked for 10 years on the Aeneid, and only under extreme duress from Augustus himself would he recite portions of it. No one knew what was going on, how far it had gotten. Virgil himself was unsure whether it would even be finished. Horace, on the other hand, was the master of shorter works. The muse for epic poetry is Calliope, but the muse for sacred song, her name is Polyhymnia. And Polyhymnia is really closer as a spiritual guiding star to Horace, whereas Calliope is the guiding star, the muse of Virgil. His second ode, his first one to Maecenas, his second ode is to Augustus. And he is saying in this ode that I am not a great writer like Virgil, writing one enormous thing. I, in fact, write many little things. And so here to you, this ode, just a selection from it. This is to Augustus Caesar. This would have been probably around 30 BC or so. Enough the ordeal now. The snow and hailstorms God has unleashed on earth whose red right hand hurled bolts at the capital's sacred summits, spreading fear in the city streets. And Horace here is alluding to some very strange happenings that meteorologically that occurred at Rome at the final battle in Egypt when Augustus was bringing Antony and Cleopatra to a final close in his Alexandrian war. Rome suffered extraordinary meteorological happenings. They were almost like ancient portents come true. And this was 30 BC. Fear in the city streets. Fear among nations, lest the age of horror should come again. When Pyrrha gasped at strange sights, old Proteus herding his whole sea zoo uphill, visiting mountaintops, and the fish people tangled in the elm trees, floundering among the ancient haunts of pigeons, and deer and terror struggling through the new spread fields of a worldwide flood. And this particular occurrence was that the Tiber River had actually flowed backwards for several hours that day, had flooded the city of Rome. The inhabitants of Rome had to flee up to the hills. They, of course, did not know instantly what had happened in Egypt, but they could tell from the events that some world-shaking change had happened. Some frame of reference and foundation of the world had shifted over in this earthquake of new portentousness. All of these events were happening. This, of course, when it was understood in later history, was understood as a millennial shift in expectation, so that when the next millennium came around, and we'll get to that, I think, in another semester or so, when the next millennium, 1000 AD, came around, people expected that this would happen again. Thus the phrase, when the millennium comes. And we have the same thing in our time with the second millennium coming. And all of it comes from the days of Augustus, when these events actually occurred and happened. Horace writes, "We watched the Tiber's tawny water, wrenched back hard from the Tuscan side, go raging forward to Vesta's temple itself, and King Numa's palace threatening their overthrow. Wild, love-lorn river god, he saw himself as avenger of his long-lamented Ilia and trespassed left across his banks, thus crossing Jupiter's wishes too." And so this tremendous portentousness that nature itself was showing that some enormous shift had taken place. And Horace, of course, found himself, just as did Virgil and the others in this mandala up here, they found themselves at the center of decision for the direction of this new shift. So it's interesting to note that in among Horace's poems, though he's living in enormously portentous times and fully capable, as you can hear from these, of writing great works, he always intersperses among these works poems of bucolic drinking in the fields, the pleasures of just sitting at home around a fire, the wondering who's dating who now with an old mistress, these kinds of small talk, humane affairs, to bring this spirit of the humanitas into the foreground, because it was rather an exotic jewel at that time to still have these, what we would call ordinary human feelings, and to prize them as wonderful achievements to enjoy. Just walking in the Roman Forum or in the Roman circus unapproached by assassins was to Horace a tremendous pleasure, an enormous achievement and accomplishment, something that had not been able to have been done for almost 3 generations. So very often later ages find these kinds of works of Horace throwaway items. How could this be a great poet? Well, when you put them in the context, and next to the other great works, you see that he's asserting that these human values also have their place. World empire or not, it's a human quality which we reinstate. one of the beautiful contrasts in Book 1 of the Odes, where he writes a earth-shaking ode and then follows it up by a little bucolic word, is at the end of Book 1, the last two odes. The 37th ode is about the death of Cleopatra, which happened in 30 BC, whose death was the final act in the whole string of wars going back to the time of Sulla, and from which date Augustus was able finally to close the doors of the Temple of Janus. You remember in the Roman Forum that they had this temple that was actually like two big arched doors, and it took 100 bolts, bars of brass and steel to close them. And Janus was the two-faced god, looking forward and past. And that this temple had been erected originally some 750 years before by Romulus, the legendary founder of Rome. And these gates had been closed twice in 750 years. And Augustus, for the third time, closed them after the death of Cleopatra when he came back. That's sort of his final act in his triumph of entering Rome to say, we are at peace. And when we are at peace, the whole world is at peace. The Pax Romana. In fact, he had to close them 3 times within a period of about 12 years. And the third time that the gates of Janus were closed was in 19 BC, when he established officially what is known in history as the Principate, the rule of the top man, from which the Roman Empire took its official aegis. The Principate of Augustus established the empire. So that the closing of these doors of the Temple of Janus was a real event. The first time that they were closed, though, was due to the fact that Augustus had brought the horrific century of war and killing to a close, and the final chapter of that was the death of Cleopatra. And the unanimous opinion of Roman writers was that Cleopatra was a real high-level witch who was out to change the total nature of the world through a perversion of Roman power, using not Egyptian or Ptolemaic forces, but using Roman forces from a Ptolemaic base for her own design. So Horace writes this ode upon hearing of the death of Cleopatra. He says, "Today is the day to drink and dance on. Dance then, merrily, friends, till the earth shakes. Now let us rival the priests of Mars with feasts to deck the couches of the gods. Not long ago it would have been high treason to fetch the Caecuban from family storerooms when the wild queen was still plotting destruction to our capital, and ruin to the empire with her squalid pack of diseased half-men, mad, wishful grandeur, tipsy with sweet good luck. But all her fleet burnt, scarcely one ship saved. That tamed her rage, and Caesar, when his galleys chased her from Italy, soon brought her dreaming and drugged with native wine back to the hard realities of fear. And swiftly as the hawk follows the feeble dove, or in snowy Thessaly the hunter the hare, so he sallied forth to bind this fatal prodigy in chains. Yet she preferred a finer style of dying. She did not, like a woman, shirk the dagger, or seek by speed at sea to change her Egypt for obscure shores, but gazing on her desolated palace with a calm smile, unflinchingly laid hands on the angry asp until her veins had drunk the deadly poison deep, and death determined, fiercer than ever, perished. Was she to grace a haughty triumph, dethroned, paraded by the rude Romans? Not Cleopatra. And so this tremendously portentous poem in this book of Odes And then following comes a little 8-line poem, which by itself one would think was just a throwaway. But it's Horace's way of balancing out the energy. And I didn't like the translations I could find, so I made a translation myself, and there's copies here if you like. This is what he follows the Cleopatra ode with. Just some little thing to balance the energy. And it has his kind of brassiness. He writes, Persian style I detest, boy. Pomp displeases me. Tied with bark garlands, don't ask in what place the rose finally abides. Simple murder. Nothing that you push I require particularly. Neither you serving unbecomes myrtle, nor me beneath the thick vine drinking. Just simple myrtle rather than Persian style dress. So this quality of Horace to write a balancing kind of a literature was a characteristic of his place in this world of balance and harmony, in this architecture of refurbishing all human values. And if you recall in the lecture on Augustus, that Augustus built this tremendous monument, the Ara Pacis, which was shaped like an old-fashioned pot. It was quite large, and on top was a statue of Augustus, and underneath Augustus was finally buried in here at the very end. But this monument was placed in the very center of the Roman Forum. It was placed in great proximity to the Temple of the Vestal Virgins. And all of these architectural monuments, these literary monuments, these political arrangements show this tremendous preoccupation with having some symmetrical order reinstated, whose structure could be understood by human intelligence and whose necessity could be appreciated by the human experience, the human-hearted experience that came from knowing the world and having seen how a century of civil war literally shreds all human values. That we agreed to live together under these forms, not because some strong man did it against us, but because intelligence and capacity and courage did it for us to save us from the chaos and the alternate to this, which we have already seen. That was the temper of the time. Horace then, when he published under the aegis of Maecenas some of his odes, some of his satires, he became instantly famous, a man of some acclaim, and it was at this time that Maecenas presented him the farm about 30 miles, 35 miles north out of Rome, that is today called Tivoli. At that spot, it was called Tiber at that time, at that spot was also the villa of another Roman poet and critic, a man named Quintilius. And it's interesting that when Quintilius died, Horace wrote an ode and brought in his association with Virgil. Now, Horace and Virgil, who were known to each other for quite some time under the aegis of Maecenas, but also in connection with this central power arrangement with Augustus. In fact, at one time when Maecenas in 37 BC had to go to Brundisium to do some negotiating with Mark Antony for Augustus, it was the kind of event that Maecenas and Augustus both wanted their poets to see the inner workings of world-class power. So both Horace and Virgil accompanied Maecenas with some other individuals to Brundisium. So we're to understand that these were not simply writers off in some garret, but they were brought into the very inner workings of the power, whether it was in the palaces or in the villas or at the negotiating tables or in private conversations or in correspondence with the emperor. You know, Augustus, a lot of his correspondence survived. And in fact, later on, some 100 or 120 years down the line, under the Emperor Hadrian, his personal secretary for a while was the Roman historian Suetonius. And Suetonius had access through Hadrian, to the family files and records of the Julian gens. And he found letters from Augustus to Horace and to Virgil. And in a short Vita Horati, Life of Horace, which is attributed to Suetonius, he quotes in there this wonderful offer from Augustus to Horace for him to be his personal secretary, and the fact that Horace had turned it down. And Augustus was not offended by this. In fact, made very light of the fact that he wished that he was able to be as free as Horace in this regard, being mobile in the world and having his druthers. He, meanwhile, of course, had to shoulder the Principe. It was also in the Suetonius life of Horace that we find the wonderful, humorous statement from Augustus in one of his letters as to the shape of Horace as an individual. Augustus had been sent this beautiful roll of Horace's poetry, and it was quite thick. And Augustus likened it to the kind of portliness of Horace, saying that he was trying to write books that were larger than himself. So this due to Suetonius in the time of Hadrian. So that the human-heartedness of Horace, his humanitas, was like a necessary complement to the religious visionaryship of Virgil. And the two of them together really form the core of the classic Augustan literature of its time. And in fact, it was only after Virgil and Horace that education in the classical world began to augment and displace somewhat the Greek models for the Roman models. It wasn't until the publishing after the death of Virgil of the Aeneid, and towards the end of his life, the works of Horace coming into definite vogue in the educational systems. And of course, classical education from that time on in the Roman Empire stressed rather on an equal basis the Greek models and the Roman models. I haven't had time to go into some of the literary forms, but just suffice to say that Horace originally, like all Roman writers, had used Greek models, except for the fact that the Ode form was really a Roman form. I think one of the critics, I think it was this Quintilius himself, who used the phrase that of all the literary forms, only the Ode was completely Roman. All the others had Hellenistic or classical Greek origins. But this relationship with Virgil, the first time that we find Horace addressing himself to Virgil is in the third Ode, actually. And he does it in a playful, Horatian way. Instead of writing the Ode to Virgil, he writes it to the ship that's going to bear Virgil to Athens. And he says, "Fare forward, good ship, and I pray may Venus, queen of Cyprus, may Helen's bright brothers, masthead stars, and may all winds kept behind bars but the northwest, the god of gales, Aeolus, so direct your sails that you who voyage promise-bound to keep your cargo safe and sound, deliver to his Attic goal Virgil, and with him half my soul." And he goes on from there. And if you recall last week's lecture, Virgil was going to Athens, having spent 10 years on the Aeneid, and was going there to refine it and polish it. And while he was at Athens, met Augustus there, probably in the vicinity of the Acropolis, and Augustus convinced him that he should go back to Rome and
polished the Aeneid in Rome, not in Athens. However, well that would have been in terms of past history, this is what they were doing now, and that it was on the way back from Athens that Virgil died. So that this was a poem actually written by Horace to lightly show his concern for Virgil setting out on this last fateful voyage. He would be dead within about 4 months. And of course, Horace knew it at the time that this ode was published. Horace, as I said earlier, lived on until 8 BC. So he lived considerably after Virgil, who died in 19 BC. So he lived another 11 years. And you have to realize here, again, as I said 2 weeks ago, that Augustus outlived them all considerably. Augustus lived to be in his late 70s. So Virgil dying in his early 50s, Horace in his late 50s, Agrippa in his 50s. Only Augustus and his wife Livia were long-lived. They lived to see this enormous span of time. Augustus was princeps for 44 years, so that the basic power mandata was well-founded and based. And he lived till 14 BC. So he had some 33 years after the death of Virgil to make sure that the Aeneid was promulgated. So you get this idea that the very center of the structure, Augustus, was really somebody. And in fact, his long liveness presented a problem for successors because he was a very weak man, ill many times in his life, many times had made out his final testament. In fact, if you remember, several times had taken the signet ring off and passed it on and then recovered and lived another 10 years or 20 years, so that the successors all died out, and he never had a son. Livia never had a child by him. And it was only after a process of, what would you say, natural selection? That the successor to Augustus became Tiberius. And in fact, his name was Tiberius Julius Caesar. Tiberius Julius Caesar. So that Augustus is between Julius Caesar and Tiberius Julius Caesar. And Tiberius had long since given up the idea of even being in contention. He had gone off to study philosophy. He had gone off to Rhodes to become an academician and be a very, very pleasant intellectual fellow. He was a masterful general, had won many wonderful battles. We'll get to Tiberius in a little bit. But it was only by an incredible fluke of circumstances that Augustus finally, when he was dying in his late 70s, realized that it was, after all, Tiberius. Well, Horace and his humanity appeal very much to Augustus. And in the book of Odes, this humanity comes out when the great friend of his, the man who had the villa up in Tibur, Tivoli, Quintilius, died. He was a great friend of Virgil. And so Horace wrote an ode to Virgil. And it was on the death of his friend. And so in the ode, he's saying to Virgil, ostensibly, no matter how great you are, your songs cannot bring our friend back to life. No matter how empowered your visioning is, and I know how great it is, you have the song of the sons of God himself, you still can't bring them back to life. And this is what the ode reads like in translation. When somebody as dear as he is dead, grief must be huge and uninhibited. Melpomene, to whom God-given belong, lyre and clear voice, teach me a funeral song. So now Quintilius sleeps the sleep which men never recover from. And who knows when honor, good faith, and naked truth will find his parallel again among mankind. He's dead. Good men in plenty mourn his end.
but none of them as bitterly as my friend Virgil. As Virgil, you, who even now still strain the power of prayer demanding back in vain life, which the gods on their terms lend and take. Though you were Thracian Orpheus and could make the woods hang listening on your lute, would music conjure the blood back to his veins, or physic? The sickly ghost, once it is past the gate, which Mercury, stern officer of fate, shuts against all entreaty, and has been made of that grim, wanded shepherd's flock a shade. Loss hurts, yet patience helps us to endure the ills no human should presume to cure. So this tremendous sense of humanity, which Horace manifests again and again in his odes, is a basis of his importance in the Augustan Principe. Well, we'll take a little break now, and then we'll come back and take a look at Ovid. How to say this? I think that if you've been coming the last 3 weeks, even if you've been coming for the whole series, you can begin to form an impression of how serious an undertaking this reconstruction of human nature and the world empire was to Augustus and to all of the individuals at the time. They were, to use the phrase, deadly serious about it. To them, it was an absolute necessity that the earth could not sustain one more generation of dissolution, such as they had witnessed. And so the literature, which formed such a central envisioning part of this program, was a very high-minded spiritual literature, the central figure of which was Virgil, and Horace occupying a very distinguished position in there, and there were others. So it was with great shock and horror to them to realize that under this umbrella of security, which they had so painstakingly erected and under such great sacrifice put up, that they should find growing like mushrooms after the rain careless and carefree secular writers who were trying to outdo the royal spiritual writers in a spirit of publicity competition and so forth. And because the population of Rome was swelling with people coming for the good life, the city swelled to well over 1 million people, on its way to 2 million. And they were there for the games, the fun, the entertainment of the world capital, the place where power and pleasure had its release. And a writer came into view who loved this limelight dearly, and that was Ovid. And Ovid, sensing this great age and being a tremendous writer in capacity, he'd been born in 43 BC, so he was born when Julius Caesar was assassinated, which meant that he came into manhood about the time that Augustus established the Principate, and at about the time in which where Virgil died. And so he came on the scene, and to him, Rome was 1 million loving souls looking for heroes to worship and writers to idolize, and he was one of them. In fact, he was probably the best, he felt. And so he began his writing career thinking of what ostentatious public recognition form could he take in this wild metropolitan capital. And he thought, well, what's on everyone's mind are romantic intrigues. And so I will take love and I will make a book. And he wrote The Art of Love, the Ars Amoratiae, which became an instant bestseller. Ovid became successful beyond his wildest imaginations, and still a young man, full of inventiveness and actual greatness of capacity. When the Artis Amoratiae was published, there were certain critics who said, well, this is pornography. This is inadmissible. And Ovid said, but I'm writing for the masses. I'm not writing of noble people who have all the great virtues intact. I'm writing for the mobs that I associate with, and we all know that this is needed. There are so many intrigues and so many affairs going astray that somebody has to write a book on how to do it right. And I have, and you can see that everyone's reading it. And he starts off in the Artis Amoratiae. He says, if anyone among this people knows not the art of loving, let him read my poem. And having read, be skilled in love. By skill, swift ships are sailed and rowed. By skill, nimble chariots are driven. By skill must love be guided. And so in this great, wonderful work, he writes, and it goes on for about 70 or 80 pages. And of course, he's eminently practical. He says, first strive to find an object for your love. You know who now for the first time come to fight in a new kind of warfare. Love is a kind of a warfare. It's a new warfare. We've got our Pax Romana, but we still have a warfare. It's the warfare of the sexes. And the next task is to win the girl that takes your fancy. And the third, to make love long endure. And this is my limit. This is the field whose bound my chariot shall mark. This, the goal my flying wheel shall graze. While you are at liberty and can go at large with loosened rein, choose to whom you will say, you alone please me. In other words, he's providing you with all the stock phrases, with all of the situations, and in fact, The Art of Love is still in print. I know a man in Hollywood who did a translation. He gets orders every month from all over. Ovid's Art of Love is fascinating, popular reading. And in its genre, it's as well done as anything that's ever been done. It's absolutely astounding. And of course, the book was so popular that he wrote a sequel. He was very much like our modern Sunset Boulevard TV writers. When you get a hit, you follow it up. And so he wrote a sequel to it called The Remedies of Love. You know, after you've been in this warfare, successful or unsuccessful, the remedies, the Remedia Amoris. And so this came out. And again, Ovid found himself absolutely lionized by Roman society. And he thought, since he had all this capacity going, he might as well shoot the whole works and go for the stars. So Ovid decided to write his own epic about Rome and its beginnings. And that epic is the Metamorphoses of Ovid. And of course, he realized that in the Ovidian style of human nature, that the transformations that count are romantic interludes and encounters. So all through the Metamorphoses, the structure of the work hinges on romantic encounters of various gods or goddesses or men and goddesses and so on down to his own day. And in between, Ovid writes some of the best told stories of all time. Just an incredible array. One of the stories, of course, reproduced in A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare, Pyramus and Thisbe. He begins the Metamorphoses, his great epic. He says, "My purpose is to tell of bodies which have been transformed into shapes of a different kind. You, heavenly powers, since you were responsible for those changes, as for all else, look favorably upon my attempts and spin an unbroken thread of verse from the earliest beginnings of the world down to my own times." So that Ovid, in his wonderful strategic sense of liveliness and his really magnificent sense of poetic structure, thought, I will outdo Virgil. I mean, he began with Troy, and this is all well and good, this is classical, but I'm going to begin with the creation of the universe. Why fool around with these little sections of history, 1,000 years? What's 1,000 years? So he goes back, before there was any earth or sea. And of course, as soon as he wrote that, he probably thought, well, I've really got it now. I'm going to overshadow and outshine the master, and I'll be it. Before there was any earth or sea, before the canopy of heaven stretched overhead, nature presented the same aspect the world over, that to which men have given the name of chaos. And so he begins there with chaos and with the creation and with the flood and with the whole cyclic nature of how time runs from a golden age to a silver age, to a bronze age, to an iron age. And then the cycle begins again with the new golden age, which is the time of Augustus. So that Ovid, of course, writing about a universal decline from a previous golden age, has this wonderful sense of structure that, in further decaying, his stories can get wilder and wilder. Why, this was just absolutely true of history, wasn't it? And he has all this information and all this opportunity. So as he wrote the Metamorphoses, and it has a tremendously complex structure, it has its balanced shapes, it has its episodes that do balance out. He became more and more capable of all kinds of yarn spinning and storytelling. He writes, finally in book 12, when he gets around to the period of history that Troy is involved with, typical turn of the millennium Roman viewpoint. He writes in one section here, in the center of the world, situated between earth and sky and sea, at a point where all three realms of the universe meet, is a place from which everything the world over can be seen, however far away, and to its listening ears comes every sound. There, rumor lives. Rumor lives where the earth, the sea, and the sky come together at that point. There is such a place in the universe, he says. And there rumor lives in a home she has chosen for herself on a hilltop. Night and day the house lies open, for she has given it 1,000 apertures and countless entrances. Rumor's house has thousands of ways in and out. Thousands. With never a door to barricade her thresholds. The whole structure is of echoing brass. Echoing. And it's full of noises. Repeating words and giving back the sounds it hears. There is no quiet within, no silence in any part, and yet there is no loud din, but only murmured whisperings, like the sound of the sea's waves heard at a distance, or the last rumbles of thunder when Jupiter has crashed dark clouds together. A whole host inhabits these halls. They come and go, a shadowy throng, and 1,000 rumors, false, mixed with true, stray this way and that, while confused words flit about. Some of them pour their stories into idle ears. Others carry off elsewhere the tales that they have been told. The story grows, and each new teller adds something to what he has heard. And here live credulity and hot-headed error, groundless joy, craving fear, sedition newly born, and whispers whose origin no one really knows. Rumor herself sees everything that goes on in heaven, in earth, and on the sea, and seeks information the world over. Well, it's absolute genius. And Ovid had it. Incredible images. And when you start to read Ovid, you can't put him down. I mean, each page just seems to grow on the next one. And certainly, when you find Ovid having the 40 or 45 years of experience that he had, and writing the Metamorphoses, and finally coming into the modern times with these wonderful images, he writes about the assassination of Caesar, getting very close to the royal family. So he says, all the same, he was a foreigner introduced into our temples from without. Caesar is a god in a city that is his own. He excelled in peace and war, but it was not so much the wars he brought to a triumphal conclusion, or his achievements at home, or his majesty swiftly won, but rather his own offspring that caused him to become a new star, a fiery-tailed comet. If you remember, there was a comet seen in Roman skies at the time of the assassination. Among Caesar's exploits, no achievement was greater than this, that he was the father of such a son. Well, he's not the father of Augustus, he was the uncle. But he's being very close to home. And finally, when he writes in here, scarcely had Jupiter finished speaking when gentle Venus in the midst of the Senate house, though none could see her, snatched away the body of her Caesar, and so that the soul that had been newly released, she did not allow it to be dispersed into the air, but bore it up to the stars in heaven. As she carried it, she felt it kindle and catch fire. Released from her bosom, this is the comet, it flew up high beyond the moon in its fiery trail, leaving a wide track behind, flashed forth as a star. Julius, the god, looking down upon the good deeds of his son, Julius, the son of Aeneas, looking down upon his son, Julius Caesar, the far distant ancestor of the Julian clans, though admits that there are greater than his own and glories in being surpassed, though Augustus forbids his own actions to be rated above those of his father, yet the talk of men, free and unrestricted by any edicts, prefers him against his will, and in this alone opposes his commands. And goes on then to talk a little bit about Augustus. Well, the book was a sensation. And Augustus, sorely offended by these actions, and citing two causes, his poem and an error, banished Ovid to the farthest reaches of the Roman Empire. Personally saw to it that Ovid was sent to the Black Sea, to a place called Tomi, that's way off on one of the bleak coasts, and Ovid never returned. And all of antiquity is silent about the causes. There was no speculation because Augustus personally did it and just cited the poem and an error. But speculation is that while we can reconstruct the poem and the idea that Ovid had just simply overstepped the bounds of legitimacy, was starting to interfere with the newly blossomed spiritual, epic-based republic, principate. What was the error? And for that, we have to think of the circumstances of Augustus' daughter, Julia. Augustus had a wife before Livia that he was married to for just a short while, Scribonia. And their short marriage, Scribonia, if you remember, was divorced by Augustus because of her nagging nature. And because it had been a political marriage, Augustus just didn't go for that sort of thing anyway. But they had a daughter named Julia, and she was a holy terror. Julia was a problem, constant problem, was well known in the city of Rome, was a very loose lady, and in fact seemed to be associated with the success of Ovid's romantic writings. And so when the Metamorphosis came out, it seemed to Augustus probably that Ovid, in his bright Sunset Boulevard personality, had taken the aegis from his daughter Julia to write the royal epic in his version, and there wasn't going to be any gospel according to Ovid. And that's why he was banished. Ovid, of course, wrote several letters in the exile, and all of them bemoaned the fact that nobody there spoke Latin or Greek or any language he had ever heard. Horace, when he published a new book of the Odes, I think, even though this was written before the exile occurred in 8 AD, gives us an insight from Horace and from Augustus into this whole affair, this cause célèbre. He wrote, this is the first ode in the third book. He wrote 4 books of odes. I have no use for secular outsiders. I bar the gross crowd. Give me reverent silence. I am the muse's priest. I sing for maidens and for boys grave verse. In other words, yes, there's fun, there's liveliness, but there's also a very serious thread of underlying meaning. And that, in fact, he and Virgil were the priests of a religious revelation, a scriptural writing, and they took very seriously this. Unheard before, earth's kings may awe their own flocks, but kings themselves are under Jove, the glorious conqueror of the giants, who with an eyebrow moves the universe. In other words, you can be flashy in Rome, but there's such a thing as the universe and men who express its movement. And so there's an enormous gulf and gap between the secular play and the real manifesting. And while there is a sense of humanitas, which is to be encouraged in the sense of balance, it is a balance to maintain that clarity and purity of ultimate vision which had come into the world at that time. One man plants vineyards broader than his neighbors. To the field of Mars, 3 candidates for office descend. One hopes high birth will gain the day, another purer fame. In character, the third his mob of clients, yet still necessity. The same just dealer allots to high and low their fates. Her large urn shuffles every name. When the bare sword blade hangs over a villain's neck, the elaborate Syracusian banquet loses its savor. Then no sound of lyres or birds and aviaries will bring him sleep again, sweet sleep that's never too proud to visit the poor peasant's cottage, a shady riverbank, or any valley ruffled by a breeze. And he goes on to write in here about the enormity of the undertaking. And in fact, a little later, in The final book of Odes, in book 4, near the end of the close of the career, the writing career of Horace, he has 2 odes to close out his books of odes. One of them to Virgil and one of them to Augustus. And it rounds out this magnificent viewpoint. Horace in book 4, the 12th ode, to Virgil. Those friends of spring, the Thracian gales, level the seas and swell the sails. The hard clods thaw, the rivers flow quietly without the melting snow that burdened them last month. The luckless bird that cries and grieves for Aegis builds now in the eaves. She who the cruel lust of kings too barbarously avenged still brings the house of Cecrops shame. He's talking about Cecrops as an image. He was the founder of the city of Athens. And he's saying, we've had our winter and we've had our spring, and now our civilization is coming into the noontide of a fruitful summer. And he's saying this in metaphor. And he's writing this to Virgil, just before Virgil died. In the soft grass, the boys who keep a watch upon the fattening sheep pipe tunes, while Pan, who takes delight in every flock and tree dark height in Arcady, is pleased. In other words, the world's at rest. There are such things as boys playing at night now. We have a peace in the world, and we have this tremendous unfolding coming. This season, the summer, the high noon of just world empire, this season brings a thirst with it, Virgil. But if you want to sit with us, friend of young noblemen, and drain wine pressed at Calais, then you'll have to pay your way. If you would like to join the spree, hurry, but bring your entrance fee. I don't intend to dip your face in wine scot-free, as if my place were stocked like a rich man's. Then come at once and pause for breath and chasing wealth, remembering death and death's dark fires. Mix, while you may, method and madness, work and play. Folly is sweet, well-timed. And so this wonderful invitation to those who would join the circle of writers to come and be with them, there is a price to pay, and there is a seriousness. And yes, we'll drink together and sup together, but we have something here which has a higher aim, which is now coming into fruition. And in fact, the winter is past, the spring is past. Now the summer of our time. And at the very end of his odes to Augustus, this tremendous outpouring. Wars won and towns sacked, high were the themes I had planned. Then Apollo twanged his rebuking lyre. Stop, little sails like yours should never challenge the Tuscan, the epic ocean. The Tuscan being Virgil, from Tuscan. Little sails like yours should never challenge the Tuscan, the epic ocean. In other words, write little poems. Don't write the big ones. Thy reign restores rich fruits to the countryside, Augustus, brings back safe to our capital standards long lost ripped from arrogant Persian temple pillars, keeps Janus's arcade empty of warfare, and shuts tight the gates there, bridles the runaway beast, license, strayed far off the true road, banishes vice and recalls the ancient rules, whereby Rome's name, Italy's majesty, faith, strength, and empire spread from the uttermost west, where the sun goes down at evening, east to the shores of his resurrection. And so this tremendous image that the Roman world was at peace, and that the circuit of Apollo's chariot, the sun, Phoebus Apollo, who was the patron deity of Augustus could rise in peace in the west and move across the entire arc of the sky and set in the east, all in one durational movement of harmony. And that not only had the earth been harmonized, but the entire celestial sphere. In fact, Horace says in one of his poems, I can now, even me with my short height, raise myself up in poetic vision so that my head touches the stars. That kind of an imagery. So that the sun can do this because Caesar stands guard. Peace is assured, the peace no power can break, not civil dissension or brute force or wrath, that weapon forger, misery maker for warring cities. Wrath, if you remember, was the thing that Homer cited in the Iliad as the reaction to wrath that causes human history to unravel, causes war, causes dissension. It's not so much wrath itself, but our response to wrath is always baiting us to get involved in that labyrinth wherein we get lost and cannot find our way home. So he says, wrath and all these weapon forgers are now locked up in caves. The doors are shut. The powers are still, kept because Augustus stands guard. We too, for our part, work days and holidays alike, among gay Bacchus's gifts to man, among prayer duly made where prayer is due, shall gather the women and children around us, and do as our forefathers did. Pipe, aiding voice, sing hymns to the heroes who died well, to Troy, to Aeneas and Chryses, kindly Venus, and all Venus's great descendants. And so ends the Odes of Horace, and so ends his writing career with this wonderful closing harmonium. And it was harmonious as long as Augustus lived, but of course he had to pass on. And his heir, Tiberius, held a precarious empire in some semblance of order. But then the long landslide of chaos, which had been resolved and held together by several generations of individuals who had understood what they were doing, but had already seen this wonderful, terrible portent of the comet of the phenomenon known as Ovid, flashing across the horizon even in their time, was like a portent of things to come. That those who would grow up under this harmonium would assume that this was just a boring, old world reality, and that there should be more exciting things to do than to just have peace. And so we next week will take a look at those generations that came born in the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, who lived under the incredible nightmares of Nero and Caligula and Domitian, and saw it all unravel again, and even worse times than before. And we have two great Romans who chronicled these events. One of them, the great Platonic philosopher Plutarch, historian, and the other, the great Roman general who became the greatest Roman historian, Tacitus, in whose annals he has chronicled from first-hand knowledge the entire unraveling of the Augustan Principate through his own descendants. And we'll see that. And next week, I hope we'll be able to get it all in. Thanks for coming tonight.